Hello and welcome to Merthyr's Hidden Past, a weekly podcast brought to you by Cyfarthfa Castle Museum and Art Gallery. My name is Christopher Parry and I have the privilege of working at Cyfarthfa Castle. And yeah, I've been there at Cyfarthfa Castle now for pretty much about 13 years. And the one thing that always strikes me and other members of staff in the museum is how the most interesting stories about Merthyr's past are not talked about. What's talked about often in Merthyr is its industrial supremacy and how it changed the world of industry through the iron and steel industries in the 19th century. While that is amazingly important, obviously, the other stories that happened around and close to that history have seemed to have taken a back step, a sideline, and they seem to have been forgotten about altogether. And so this podcast is entirely dedicated to those lesser known stories about this industrial giant of a town and a valley, Merthyr Tydfil in South Wales. So yeah, last week we finished off our story about Evan Powell, who was a miner and a medium from South Wales, and he rose to fame as the personal medium for Arthur Conan Doyle. And so if you haven't listened to that, go back, have a listen, be much appreciated. The people that have listened so far are fantastic, to be honest. Hundreds of people have tuned in and listened and been very complimentary and have really made my day, to be honest. There was a lady even speaking about listening to the episodes while painting a fence, which really cheered me up and really gave me a passion to do this more and more and more. So thank you very much for everyone for your comments and support. So this week we're going to focus on another unknown story. The story starts, as most stories do, with one person at the centre, and that person is named John Dennithorne. And this is the story about the Dowlais Educational Settlement. John Dennithorne was not native to Merthyr. He was born in London in 1895 and he trained and grew up to be an extremely accomplished sculptor and artist. How he came to end up in Merthyr Tydfil was mainly to do with his connections with the Quaker movement. He was a Quaker himself and he did much travelling to help worthy causes around the world. So he was no stranger to travelling far from London, like places like Russia for example, to help those in need of help. And so, in 1928, the need for help arose in Dowlais, a place in Merthyr Tydfil. So to give you an indication of what was happening in Dowlais at the time, we need to backtrack ever so slightly. Now, in the 19th century, Merthyr was home to 4 great ironworks, all situated less than 2 miles apart from each other really, all making a massive impact on industrial Wales and industrial Britain really, producing a gigantic amount of iron. It can't be understated how big the industry was and how it attracted thousands of people to Merthyr, making Merthyr the largest and most populated place in all of Wales. By the end of the 19th century though, this had all changed. Cyfarthfa Ironworks, once the largest in the world, had now been opened and closed so many times that people didn't really know what the heck was going on with it, to be honest. It would limp its way through to the early 20th century, but be a total shadow of its former self. Plymouth Ironworks and Pendarren Ironworks would be totally closed by the close of the 19th century. And Dowlais, the great Dowlais Ironworks, the once employing well over 7,000 people, closed. And the furnaces at Dowlais were brought down. So making our way into post-war Merthyr, you were looking at a population that was devastated by the lack of industry that existed in the town. So by 1928, people like John Dennithorne and other people were seeing and hearing stories of population at Dowlais struggling and in need of help in different ways. So he came to Merthyr and tried to establish an unemployed working men's and boys group. The idea of this club was to give unemployed men and boys something to do, an outlet, a place to go, something to experience that was different from just the drudgery of day-to-day life. And trust me when I say that the hardships endured by the people of Merthyr during the late 1920s and 1930s are astounding. And so yeah, John Dennithorne would to come here, establish that group in 1928, and then slowly that class, that unemployed men's and boys group, would then turn into what's known as an educational settlement. But we backtrack ever so slightly. John established that club, the Working Men's Unemployed Club, and it grew so quick that he had to try and rehouse it in a different place. Initially, it was in a small building on Horse Street in Dowlais. But because the unemployment was so large and so many people were coming of a night just to get out of the house, just to do something different, just to converse and talk to other people, is that they had to get a new base. So eventually he set up shop in a place called Trewern House. The idea would be to extend the Unemployed Working Men's Boys Club and generally do more and more for the community. Eventually, with the board of trustees in place, the educational settlement, with John acquiring the larger premises, would be bigger and bigger and bigger. And so from there they coordinated a variety of different educational classes like English literature, sociology, psychology, music, gymnastics, many hands-on classes as well, such as carpentry and more. All were taught. All tutors were voluntary, and then eventually women and girls classes and clubs were established in exactly the same way. Child welfare was also very high on the agenda of John Dennithorne and the people in the educational settlement. So nurseries and other similar ventures began. And John also tried to implement new ways of doing things as well. And some of the new ways of doing things are astounding when you kind of think of them. He was constantly going around Dowlais and constantly lamenting the fact that the housing was of low, uninhabitable quality. And by uninhabitable, there was water ingress, there was walls coming down, it was called slum dwellings for a reason. They were built haphazardly and quick to support iron industry workers, and then because they weren't maintained, because people didn't have the funds to maintain, because they weren't employed, they went down and down and down in quality, and the maintenance just fell out totally. And so John was constantly trying to push to get better quality housing for all the people in Dowlais, but he was getting nowhere really. He took it upon himself to try a social experiment, which I think kind of really stands up and shows the type of man John Dennithorne is, I think. The idea was, he's got all of these unemployed men, working men around him, and so he thought, right, I will use that skill and the transferable skills they've learned in industry, and then we will build our own housing. And so the idea was to clear 4 slum dwellings or cellar dwellings, however you want to describe them, very bad quality working class housing, and then build 2 amazing high modern 3-bedroom rooms in their place. The reason he was doing this is because he petitioned time and time again the local government to change the housing, the local council and Welsh government to change the housing, but no one was doing anything. So he had these 4 houses and he thought, right, I'm going to do something about it. And so he got together unemployed workers. He got an architect from Cardiff to create plans for free. He got the workers all on a volunteer basis. And then they went around building their own houses. And he succeeded. He built these 2 amazing high quality 3-bedroom houses using unemployed workers and using donations and using funds that were donated to buy the building materials and things like that. An astounding venture that really changed the lives of a handful of people who were to eventually live in these houses. And he was quoted as saying, in 1935, I have derived more satisfaction both as an artist and a man from my share in one chapter of activity among the unemployed people of Dowlais than if I had carved the most applauded piece of sculpture in all of Europe. And though there's a good hefty dose of melodrama in that statement, he means every single word of it. He genuinely means it, that the satisfaction he had, because he was hitting so many walls from local government up to national government to change these people's lives, that seeing these desperate workers take their future in their own hands with him leading was a massive thing, a massive impact. The same year that those houses were built, 1935, the education in Dowlais were engaging with hundreds upon hundreds of people in many, many different ways, be it from an education class to a nursery to any manner of different things. At that same time as well, between 1933 and 1935, Merthyr Tydfil town. Now Merthyr is made up of lots of different villages and areas. The whole borough itself is called Merthyr Tydfil. But then you've got Dowlais, which is its own little community and village, and was gigantic in its own right back in the day. Then you've got Merthyr Town Centre, Merthyr Tydfil Town Centre, then you've got various other villages. The need was so great for Dowlais that Dowlais had the lion's share of all the educational settlement activity. So when people in Merthyr and the surrounding town centre area needed similar support and help, so Merthyr then established its own educational settlement, which kind of confuses the story slightly. But the reason that I mention it is because the ideology of the two groups were identical. And John Dennithorne's counterpart, the warden in the Merthyr settlement, Miss Williams, said a quote in the Merthyr Express which sums up really what these educational settlements were about. And I'll read you that now. It says, "We know what we want the settlement to be. A place where people are free to follow their interests and to gain experience and knowledge in fields which offer satisfaction to the human spirit." Both groups developed throughout the 1930s and both had a keen focus on art. And obviously John Dennithorne, being an artist and a sculptor, was key to kind of that more than anything. Another key development in John Dennithorne's career as warden for the Dowlais Educational Settlement was the purchase of a house next door to where he was based. So you had Trewern House in Dowlais, and then next door was a house called Gwenthloyn House. Now Gwenthloyn House was purchased by a lady called Miss Mary Horsfall. She purchased that and then almost immediately give it over to the settlement so he could base classes there, and eventually it would even have a room in Gwenthloyn House that would become an art gallery. Other artists would start being attracted to Dowlais in different ways as well. So for example, the art appreciation classes John Dennithorne was kind of putting in place and getting up and running in Dowlais were inviting artists and speakers to come. The more John Dennithorne developed the art appreciation classes and cultural movements in Dowlais to try and better the lives of the unemployed there, is the more awareness he created in the artistic community of the situation in Dowlais, of the people literally starving and not knowing where their next meal is coming from, not knowing where the money for clothing or housing is going to come from. And so artists from all over Wales and further afield were come in and contribute into these classes, and even contributing demonstrations of their craft to the people in Merthyr to try and help them, just to try and relieve, like I say, that humdrum repetitive nature of the depression in Dowlais. And so if you look, for example, the artist Esther Granger was heavily involved with the Pontypridd Educational Settlement, but she had a close friend called Cedric Morris, who she brought in to be involved in educational settlement movements that she knew about and that were happening in Ponty and further afield. And Cedric Morris eventually would come to Merthyr, like Esther Granger, and give classes. So Cedric Morris in 1939, this phenomenally skilled artist that was born in Swansea back in the day, he came to Merthyr in 1939, wrote letters to and from his partner and saying that he had started an art class in Gwenthloyn House in Dowlais. And he simply started it, and he had a group of unemployed workers, men and women, and he bought paints from Woolworths, got some cheap paper, brought them up and did some painting on the mountainsides around Dowlais of various scenes. And there's actually 2 paintings that Cedric Morris depicted of Dowlais during the 1930s on display in Cyfarthfa Castle Museum. And it was those paintings that he was painting there while unemployed workers were watching him and then trying to do their own version. And that's just a snippet of what was going on. There was people like David Bell, Esther Granger, who I mentioned, would come in talking to people and trying to help them to have an appreciation and an awareness of art in the hope that it would better their lives. In 1940, there's another artist that was attracted through chance more than anything to Trewern House and John Dennithorne, and his name is Arthur Giardelli. Now if you go in Cyfarthfa Castle Museum or to the National Museum of Wales, you will see work by Arthur Giardelli. He is a contemporary abstract artist to use reclaimed material to create pieces, but that is just scratching the surface, to be honest. But he started out, he was a teacher in Folkestone, and during 1940 Folkestone, the school was evacuated in its entirety. All the kids and all the teaching staff came to Merthyr Tydfil to live out the war years in Merthyr Tydfil in this safe place, this environment. Now Merthyr was still struggling, and Dowlais was still struggling even into the 1940s. Even though certain factory developments were starting to happen, certain employers were now starting to come to the town, and the war effort itself naturally brings a bit of an influx in industry and manufacturing. There was still struggles and still a need for the educational settlement going on. So in 1940, when the evacuees came, Arthur Giardelli was a teacher, believe it or not, employed by Folkestone School. But he was struck off because he was a conscientious objector during World War II, and he firmly believed that it was against his religion to fight and to kill. Now he would offer his services to do non-combatant skills, roles and things like that, but either way, because he was outed as a conscientious objector, parents sending their kids to be taught by Arthur Giardelli were complaining that they didn't want their child taught by a person who was anti-war and who was this, who was that, and so the school sacked him. And so he found himself in Merthyr, Arthur Giardelli, with a family to provide for as well, jobless and penniless. John Dennithorne took him in, gave him housing and work and employment in the Dowlais Settlement School. But then what that did for Arthur Giardelli, he was a music teacher going into Trewern, but he would come out of the late 1940s, 1950s as one of the most well-known and well-established artists produced in that era. Another wayward artist was the artist Heinz Koppel. Now Heinz Koppel was actually a German surrealist artist who escaped persecution in his homeland, and he was living in Britain. Local people in Merthyr Tydfil, they started thinking, we need to form some sort of established group for all this art movement. So the educational settlement in Merthyr and in Dowlais got together and they formed the Merthyr Art Society. And one of the first things they wanted to do is they wanted to open a permanent art studio in Merthyr with a qualified inspirational artists working with the local community to offer classes in drawing, in colouring, in mixing, in graphic art, in painting, for kids as well as adults, all genders irrelevant. And so Heinz Koppel was known by a variety of people in the settlement and connected to it, and he was brought to Merthyr in 1945 to start this studio and to spearhead an artistic movement and to continue on the work that had been established many years previously, like by John Dennithorne, by Cedric Morris, by all these other people that were establishing these classes. It was the culmination of this path from the early 1930s, teaching these classes. Now they've got to a point where they're employing an artist full-time to teach and to explore the world of art for people. And people still all over Merthyr now who remember going to Koppel's classes, learning different art techniques. To encapsulate all of John Dennithorne's story into a 20 to 30 minute podcast, whatever this turns out to be, was always going to be pretty impossible. because his life was so full of unique stories. Like the story of when he met, when he brought the king around Dowlais and he was showing him the quality of the housing and things like that that existed in Dowlais at the time. And he caused outrage, not because of what he was saying, but because he didn't wear a tie. He didn't wear a tie meeting the royal family, which apparently was really not the done thing at the time. Not only that, is later on in life he would be an integral part of peace activism and peace movements and be a part of the CND, ban the bomb marches. He would even be arrested at various points in his life for protesting at various peace demonstrations and things like that, for activism. He would eventually die in Merthyr in 1984. I mean wholeheartedly, as I could not sum this man up in one podcast, but hopefully you've got a bit of an indication as to the impact that this man had and why you'll find, if you wander around Merthyr, certain things like there's Dennithorne close scattered around, certain little bits of his name exist and certain rooms and areas are named after him. And hopefully you now understand why that is and who John Dennithorne is. And if you want to find out more, certainly go to cyfarthfa.com, the downloadable content tab. I will put some extra detail on this whole thing on there so you can download as a PDF, some pictures and other things. But hopefully you've enjoyed learning more about the Dowlais Educational Settlement and about how it developed. And thank you very much for listening. And hopefully I will be back with you next week.